The hitchhiker's curse. The rain came in sheets, a drumming tattoo on the roof of my decrepit Volvo that echoed the anxiety thrumming in my chest. It was late past midnight, and the lonely stretch of Highway 16, known around here as the Devil's Backbone, deserved the name. No streetlights, no houses, only an endless ribbon of asphalt slicing across a dense, whispering forest. I'd been naive to think I'd be able to return to Portland from the conference in Salem. Now there was fatigue, and the oppressive darkness felt like a physical weight. Then I spotted him just outside the range of my headlights. One man sat as a lone figure hunched under a skeletal oak, his thumb up outstretched begging. I hesitated. Hitching a ride with strangers on a night like this seemed unwise. But the gnawing guilt overpowered my apprehension. He looked completely miserable, drenched through. I stopped, gravel crunching beneath my tires. A man rushed to the vehicle, his face hidden beneath the sagging brim of a soggy hat. He all but lunged into the passenger seat, a convulsion jolting his body. "Thanks, man," he said hoarsely, as his voice broke. "You're a lifesaver. Been out here for hours." "No problem," I said, attempting reassurance. "Where are you headed?" "Just further down the road. Anywhere's better than here." He didn't suggest a destination specifically, which has been a touchstone of my anxiety. He was a strange fellow. Thin, almost gaunt, with eyes that appeared to soak up the dim light from the dashboard. His clothes, although wet, were strangely formal, a dark, wrinkled, and stained suit. He smelled like wet soil and something else, something metallic and vaguely sinister. The wipers made a steady sound, and we drove quietly for some time, the engine humming. I attempted to engage him in conversation, but he kept his answers to a minimum, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked windshield. He finally opened his with voice, almost a whisper. "Listen, I have to talk to you about something." I looked at him, worry written on my face. "What is it?" His knuckles were white around the edge of the seat, and he paused. "Whatever you do," he said, voice thick with urgency, "don't look in the back seat after midnight. Don't even think about it. Just promise me." His words lingered like a cloud, dark and foreboding. My rational mind scoffed at the ridiculousness, but a reptilian fear started to curl in my gut. "What's back there?" I said, my voice shaking a little. He didn't reply, his jaw set tight. "Just promise me. It's for your good." I thought about demanding an explanation and kicking him out right then. But something in his eyes, a naked, desperate terror, made me pause. He fully believed what he was saying. "Okay," I said slowly, "I swear. I'm not going to look at the back seat." The remainder of the drive was excruciating. A mile was an eternity during those weeks. I kept looking back in the rearview mirror, struggling with the powerful temptation to look. The hitchhiker was mute, a statue of anxiety. At last, the digital clock on the dashboard turned to 12:01 a.m. A burst of adrenaline coursed through me. It was past midnight. The witching hour. I clutched the steering wheel, knuckles white. The sound of the wind rustling the leaves, and the shifting of a dark silhouette, all echoed, reverberated that sense in the very air of malice, evil. It was heavy in the car silence. I tried to distract myself. I cranked the radio, but it roared with static. I thought of my family, of the warm comfort of my bed, but the hitchhiker's warning blared in my head, drowning out all other thoughts. It was too much to resist. I found myself checking the rearview mirror. I knew better, but the curiosity was a savage beast, gnawing at my resolve. "Don't," the hitchhiker whispered, as if he could read my thoughts. His voice was hoarse, the words like a plea. "Please, don't." But it was too late. The dam had broken. I could resist no longer. In a quick, defiant shrug, I glanced in the rearview mirror. My breath caught in my throat. My heart slammed against my ribs. It was there. The hitchhiker himself stared back at me from the back seat. But it wasn't the living, breathing man next to me. This was a corpse. Still roommate pale and inanimate, his eyes void and unseeing yet bore into me with frightening intensity. His skin was pulled taut against his bones and a stain was blossoming dully across his chest. It was a grisly, terrifying tableau. It was the sound that I screamed, difficult and primitive, it cut the silence. I lurched, and the car went out from under me. The Volvo veered off the road, smashing through the undergrowth, branches clawing at the metal. Then, everything went black. I woke to a pounding headache and the smell of gasoline. The car was a twisted hulk, pinned between two ancient trees. The rain had ceased falling, and a sliver of the moon looked through the canopy, casting a fanciful glow on the scene. I staggered to escape, my limbs groaning with the effort. I turned to my right, half expecting to see the hitchhiker. But he was gone. Vanished. Panic seized me. I got out of the car, legs wobbly. I had to get help. I had to find the road. But when I looked around, I sensed something was terribly wrong. This wasn't that side of Highway 16. This wasn't even the same forest. These were ancient trees with gnarled branches, reaching out like skeletal arms. The smell of rot heavy in the air. There was no noise, no hint of human life. Just the oppressive silence of the woods. I attempted to get back, yet the woods around me appeared to move and alter, moving me further into its thick. I was lost. Utterly and hopelessly lost. When the first rays of dawn penetrated the trees, I found a clearing. And at the center of the clearing, I found it. A rusted wooden sign, nearly consumed by surrounding vegetation. I had to walk gingerly up to it, my heart racing in my chest. The inscription was worn, but I could still discern the words. Welcome to Silent Hollow. Population, eternal. Suddenly, I felt very, very nauseous. I understood now. The hitchhiker. The warning. The car crash. It all made sense. I hadn't simply picked up a hitchhiker. I had picked up a ghost. And by checking the back seat after midnight, I had become ensnared. The hitchhiker's curse. I was not on Highway 16 anymore. I was in some forsaken land, a limbo for the damned. And I'd be doomed to roam these woods for eternity, another permanent fixture in Silent Hollow, forever scarred by the sight of the dead body in the backseat. And I knew, with a cold certainty, that I would be waiting for the next driver who didn't see, ready with a desperate warning of my own, one that would never be heeded. And the cycle went on as Silent Hollow took its next soul. It began to rain once more, a gentle stream that washed my tears and mixed my sorrow into the damp soil. I was home. Permanently. The blackout. The needle on the fuel gauge stubbornly rested above E, a blatant lie. I should have known that I needed to fill up in Oak Haven, but the gas station seemed as if it hadn't served a customer since the Eisenhower administration. Now, here I was, stranded. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died, leaving me in a darkness so deep it was like being buried alive. I'd been driving forever, the ribbon of asphalt unspooling infinitely beneath the crushing weight of the night sky. Some forgotten travel blog had declared this back road scenic route status, and it had earned that designation by the time we found it. Sighing, and causing the already dirty windshield to fog up, I reached for my phone. No service. Of course. I clicked on the flashlight app, a dim, feeble beam against the advancing black. It lit up the inside of the car, the collection of empty coffee cups, rolled-up maps, and half a bag of stale pretzels. Reassuring in their familiarity and utterly worthless. I took the flashlight out of the glove compartment, the real deal, heavy, with a promise of zeroing in with a stronger beam. I clicked it on. The world beyond the car window coalesced into sharp relief. Just road, on either side a dark, impenetrable wall of trees. Silence. Damn it. I opened the hood and looked into the engine. A tangle of hoses, wires, and metal that seemed as alien as hieroglyphics. I didn't even know what I was looking for, but I felt I had to at least look like I was doing something. As I played with some random wire, I heard at first a faint whisper, floating on no gust. It was near, just outside the car. I panicked. Flashlight beam trained on the engine. Hello. I croaked, my voice thin and reedy in the expanse. Silence. Only the hum of tinnitus in my ears, taunting me. I told myself it was my imagination, a symptom of fatigue and an increasing unease. I returned to fiddling around under the hood, disconnecting a hose that seemed especially out of place. Another whisper, nearer this time. The voices swirled, murmuring together, somewhere beyond the range of the flashlight beam. Panic started scratching at the outer limits of my composure. I slammed the hood closed and frantically dove back into the car, locking the doors with a panicked click. I swung the flashlight beam in all directions in the darkness outside. Nothing. It was the wind, I told myself, tricking my ears, but the air was still, weighted with the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. So, I took a deep breath and tried the ignition once more. No luck. Just the discouraging click of an expiring battery. I knew I needed to get out of the car. My phone didn't work. Maybe if I walked far enough I'd find a house, something. I just couldn't stay here. I took another deep breath, steeled myself, and opened the car door. The blackness came in, heavy and choking. I held the flashlight aimed ahead of me, cutting a little sound of comfort as I penetrated the black. That's when I saw them. Just outside the light, dimly out of the shadows, were figures. Tall and thin and completely still. They were blurry, featureless, like charcoal drawings fading out of existence. I moved the flashlight across them, but they were statuesque, frozen at home. But the instant the beam wobbled off, even for the briefest of moments, I could see the nearly undetectable change, a slight blink, a readjustment. They acted in the frame of invisibility. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I flashed the flashlight on and off, an anxious strobe of illumination and horrifying images. Each time the beam dimmed, they moved and crept closer. Each time it flared back to life, they froze, mute, waiting. They were surrounding the car. Trapped. I retreated to the car and slammed the door behind me. The sibilant sound grew louder, seeming to rustle through the metal of the vehicle. I could hear them talking, but I didn't understand the language. It was ancient and guttural, and something resonated deep inside my bones, tapping into a primal fear I never knew existed inside me. I smashed my face on the cold glass of the window, desperate to search the darkness. There were more of them now, dozens, maybe hundreds, all standing still on the fringe of the light. They were patiently restricting the circle, tightening their noose on my prison. I knew what they wanted. They wanted the dark. They instructed me to switch off the light. But if I switched off the light, they would come. I knew it with a certainty that sent a chill through me. They'd come and what? I didn't know. But the idea was unbearable. Hours became a strobe-lit eternity of fear-enabled hypervigilance. The flashlight beam started to dim, the battery complaining. October 23, 2023, Times Trains Digger. I was at risk of becoming paralyzed by despair. Was this how it ended? Trapped at an abandoned street, outnumbered by critters who lurked in the absence of light? The flashlight stuttered again, the beam a feeble, bloody orange glow. It was almost dead. I gazed across the figures, now a little less black, faces coalescing from shadowy into expressions of hunger. They knew. They knew the light was fading. Home and I had survived a long day of travel, finally tame and still, curled up in bed together when we were jolted from slumber by what could only be described as a low, guttural growl from the surrounding blackness, a vibrating sound that penetrated the car and deep into my marrow. This was it. I held my breath and turned off the flashlight with shaking fingers. The darkness was total, absolute. I shut my eyes, steel to the inevitable. The whispers stopped. Silence. Then one raspy breath, very close to my ear. I shut my eyes as tightly as I could, only to feel tears streaming down my face. A skeletal, cool hand stroked my cheek. And then, nothing. The sun rose. Slowly, I blinked my eyes open. Morning sunlight dripped over the car like honey. The road was empty. The trees shade safe, long shadows. The whispers were gone. I grabbed the flashlight, expecting it to be dead. But to my surprise, the beam blazed to life, strong and steady. I jumped out of the car, taking in my surroundings, half expecting to spot the figures lingering in the dark. But there was nothing. Just the gentle rustle of leaves in the morning air. Had it all been a nightmare? An hallucination, induced by fatigue and fear? I didn't know. But something was different. Something had changed. I felt empty, hollowed out. Like something of myself had been taken, absorbed by the dark. I returned to the car and restarted the ignition. The engine coughed and sputtered, then came alive with a roar. I drove out into the light. But I could tell, with a shivery certainty, that it had gone with me. And that somewhere in the darkest depths of my mind, the whispers continued to whisper. Waiting for the next muzzling. Waiting for the dark. The broken GPS. The rain pounded on the windshield of Eleanor's old Volvo, smearing the already hazy lines of the rural highway. She had white knuckles from gripping the steering wheel. It was a trip she had taken many times before, a pilgrimage that needed to be made to see her sick mother in the small, forgotten town of Havenwood. It was no longer to her liking, though she usually liked the drive, the solitude comforting for the city's non-stop cacophony. But an uneasy feeling gnawed at her tonight. She looked at the GPS that was fixed on her dashboard. In 2 miles, bear right, the mechanical voice droned, its typically monotonous tone unusually grating. Eleanor sighed. This GPS, an old relic of her late husband, David, used to get her into trouble, sending her on twisted detours down barely navigable back roads. David always insisted it had a mind of its own, a feeling that she used to dismiss as sentimental nonsense. Now, she wasn't so sure. She turned onto a narrow, unpaved road, following the GPS's instructions. Overhanging branches reached out to the car, their long, skinny fingers clinging, scratching against the roof. The road was terrible, littered with potholes that could have swallowed the Volvo whole. Recalculating, the GPS chirped, its synthetic voice cracking with an unexpected tremor. Proceed with caution. Eleanor frowned. Caution? That's new. The road shrank and twisted its way around thick woods on both sides. The air thickened fat and lour, heavy with the rooty smell of rot. An owl hooted far off, its mournful call sent a shiver up her spine. She checked the GPS. It showed her miles away from where she wanted to be, but the landscape was growing more and more alien, one that was more and more not home. In 1 mile, turn left, said the GPS, but the robotic tone had vanished. Replacing it was a voice almost faltering, hoarse, yet very much human. Please, turn left. Eleanor gasped. What the hell? While it was still on, she struggled with the volume, wanting to turn it lower, but the voice on the other end didn't stop. It whispered, rather it shouted with a voice blurred with static noise. Left, please, you have to. Terror seized her. This wasn't a glitch. This was something different, something malevolent. She wanted to pull over, to turn around, but the road was too narrow, the trees crowded too close. She was stuck, a bug caught in the web of a spider. She turned left against her better judgment. The road vanished into something no more than a rutted track, overgrown with weeds. The Volvo protested, groaning, the suspension straining against the assault. The woods became dark, all that remained of sound was the fearful pounding of her heart. Thank you, the voice whispered, clearer, more distinct now. It sounded slight, mildly evoking. David? No, that was impossible. David was gone, dead for 5 years. Who is this? She said, her voice quaking. What do you want? The GPS paused, then, help me, please. They're here. Who's here? Eleanor sobbed, her mind spinning. Where are you? The GPS chirped in, the graveyard, down at the end of the road, they're waiting. The graveyard. Havenwood Cemetery. A cold dread washed over her. She knew that graveyard. It was old and neglected and full of crumbling tombstones and forgotten memories. She sped up, desperate to make it there, to find out what was going on. At last the trees cleared and she saw it. The graveyard. Bathed in the unearthly glow of her headlights, it appeared even more barren than she remembered. The drizzle had ceased, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and something else, something metallic. She stopped the Volvo at the corner of the graveyard, hand trembling as she reached for the door handle. Who are you? She pleaded one last time. Tell me. The GPS crackled, and then the voice, clearer than ever, said, look at the last grave. She got out of the car, tentatively. The earth squished under her feet, the mud pulling at her shoes. She walked slowly, eyes scanning the rows of weathered headstones. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the centuries of painful history righted on her shoulders. Then she saw it. At the far end of the cemetery, newly dug. Soil heaped up next to its yawning maw. One flickering candle threw long dancing shadows across the tableau. Her heart was racing as she made her way closer, and it made her catch her throat. Stuck crudely to a wooden stake pounded into the newly turned dirt was a small sign, hand-lettered. Eleanor looked at it, her blood running cold. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. The letters blurred through the tears now pouring down her cheeks. The sign said, Eleanor Harding. She was screaming, stepping back, her brain incapable of processing the sickening sight in front of her. She spun to run, to get back to the Volvo, but she was too late. Shadows loomed, hiding the figure in the dark. They crept in at a slow, practiced pace, their eyes shining with a devilish glow. They were almost there, approaching, arms extending. Then, the voice returned, no longer a desperate plea but a triumphant, spine-tingling laugh. It was David's voice, her dead husband's. "Welcome home, Eleanor," he whispered, and a darkness closed around her. The Volvo waited at the edge of the graveyard, its dead GPS pulsing an angry green into the night. The newly dug pit awaited its victim, hungering for the next soul to fall into the grotesque torment of a cursed device and a love that would not die. The roadside shrine. On this stifling July day, I was driving my worn-out Volvo down a deserted highway. The sun beat down mercilessly, making the asphalt look like a shimmering mirage. I was driving to my sister's upstate, a drive I typically loved. Today, though, heaving as I was, a sense of dread had started to creep up on me. It was the lack of contact, I told myself. Mile after mile of empty road, interrupted only by the odd broken-down farmhouse or sun-bleached billboard. I turned down the windows, wishing for the hot wind to drain my head, but the sensation still held. As I rounded a bend, I saw a small, weathered shrine huddled at the edge of the road. Rough-hewn stones had been used to build it, and a weird assortment of gizmos covered its surfaces. Tacked to the stone were faded photographs of the subjects gazing out with mournful eyes. Half-melted candles balanced on makeshift shelves, wax dripping down onto the stones like petrified tears. I'm not typically the roadside attraction type, but I was magnetized by this place. Perhaps it was the delirium from the heat, or perhaps the escalating discomfort had made me more curious than normal. Whatever the reason, I slowed down, the tires crunching on gravel as I pulled over. I felt a chill as I neared despite the stifling heat. It felt as though, with each worship at the shrine, the air itself was gaining weight, pushing against me. The photographs were the least bearable. They were portraits of people of all ages, their faces marked with a common look of deep sorrow. Some were old, their prints streaked and faded. Others appeared older, the colors still bright, their smiles frozen in time. I saw a small, hand-painted sign that said, "Remember us." No other explanation. No names. Just remember us. My heart pounded in my chest. It felt wrong, voyeuristic, to be here. But the morbid curiosity was in control. I took out my cell phone, believing I would take one picture. A memento from this weird, disquieting place. The flash startled me. The stark light revealed the faces in the photos for a split second, and they looked almost alive. I took the photograph quickly and stepped back, a strange combination of guilt and fascination crawling inside of me. I looked at the photo again back in the car. It was a clear shot of the shrine, the crumbling stones, the yellowing photographs, the half-melted candles. I was scrolling through my gallery to delete it when I stopped myself. The image was compelling. A sobering reminder of lives lived and lost. I put the phone down and started the car, merging back onto the highway. I tried to clear my throat of misgivings, focusing on the road ahead. But then I looked in the rearview mirror. For just a moment, I thought I noticed a flicker of movement in the back seat. A shadow. I checked the mirror, suspecting I had simply been saccharined by a distortion of lighting. The back seat was empty, as it should be. But then, I saw them. Faces were beginning to appear in the reflection of the rearview mirror. Faint, phantom faces layered over the vacant rear seat. Familiar faces. Faces from the shrine. The eyes gazing back from the mirror were accusatory, mournful. I hit the brakes, tires screeching on the asphalt. My heart pounded in my chest. I spun around and looked in the back seat. Nothing. Just the familiar fabric of the seats, the old map, the water bottle I hadn't discarded. I shook my head, feeling the need to rationalize what I'd witnessed. Fatigue, stress, heat stroke, any of them could be the culprit. Taking a deep breath, I resumed driving, forcing myself to concentrate on the road. But the faces remained. At first, they were so subtle they hardly seemed true. But mile after mile, they became clearer, more defined. Their expressions tightened, going from mournful to accusatory to something threatening. And then the candles began to arrive. I smelled at first a dull, waxy stench that filled the car. I thought it was my imagination, so I dismissed it. But then, I saw them. Spike and flame and bright, flickering fire in the corner of my eye. Small votive candles, exactly like the ones at the shrine, had appeared in the dashboard, on the passenger seat, as well as in the cup holders. Panic began to set in. I stopped again, desperately trying to snuff out the candles. But they burned to the touch, hot against my fingers. And no matter how many I extinguished, more seemed to sprout in their place. The faces in the mirror were bolder now, contorted with rage. One of them, a young woman with long, dark hair, appeared to be trying to speak, her lips moving without sound. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice quaking. "What have I done?" The faces didn't answer. They were just staring, eyes burning into me. I knew that I had to dispose of the photograph. It was the only explanation. The shrine never wanted to be captured, didn't want to be removed as some grotesque memento. It wanted to be left alone. And now, it was punishing me. I fished for my phone, deleting the photo from my gallery. But the faces remained. The candles still flickered. What had once been hot air turned cold, as if no longer in need of the sulfur and soot that had heated it up, instead filling the valley with something that downhill only gets colder. The heat waves become ice waves, they surround me, and I breathe them in. Motivated by a terrifying need to placate whatever force I had pissed off, I whipped the car around and returned to the shrine. As I pulled into a nearby parking lot, the sun was starting to set. In the low light, the shrine appeared even more intimidating, the shadows thickening around it. I stepped out of the car, shaking up to my legs. The faces in the rearview mirror still scowled at me, the expressions unforgiving. I walked toward the shrine, my hands trembling. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, what offering I could make to atone for my transgression. Then, I saw it. A small bare patch on the stone wall, where a picture had hung. I understood. I took a picture out of my wallet. It was a picture of my own family, my wife, my children, my sister. A glimpse of the life I loved. I hung the photograph on the stone wall with trembling hands, filling the void. I lingered, muttering an unheard prayer, a vow to remember. When I was leaving, I looked in the rearview mirror. The faces remained, but a difference was afoot. Their faces no longer bore the look of anger. They were accepting. And then, they faded away. The flames flared and extinguished, wax pooling and stiffening on the dashboard. That cold had lifted now, replaced by the familiar summer heat. I climbed back into the car and drove away, the shrine fading off. I never looked back. It shook me, changed me, forever. That day I learned a valuable lesson: some things are best left undisturbed. Certain memories are too sacred to be snared, too potent to be drained. And some places should never be remembered. The headlights behind you. The eternal black ribbon of Highway 17 wove through the Appalachian foothills like a sleepy snake. Rain, a dark, greasy drizzle swollen with the autumn to come, stuck to the windshield. Arthur's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He had been driving for 6 hours, trying to escape a gnawing anxiety that had embedded itself in his gut since he left his father's bedside at the hospital. The prognosis was grim, a phrase that turned to ash in Arthur's mouth. He looked back in the rearview mirror. 2 pinpricks of light, steady and disturbingly near, burned through the rain-smeared glass. Headlights. Just headlights. But there was something about them that made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. He'd noticed them a while ago, a soft presence in his periphery. Initially, he had dismissed them as just another car taking the long haul. But tonight the highway was deserted. He hadn't encountered another vehicle in at least an hour. Those headlights, they didn't give up. Unnervingly so. Arthur gave the accelerator a push. The needle on the speedometer began to inch upward, the engine emitting a low, nervous rumble. 80, 85, 90. The rain thickened, obscuring an already hazy world outside the car's windows. He risked a second look in the mirror. The headlights remained in their place. The very same distance behind him. Impossibly close. An icy dread, a sensation not flagged since boyhood nightmares, began to flower in his chest. He reminded himself it was fatigue, the stress of the past weeks, the suffocating air hanging over his father's hospital room. But the rationalizations came off brittle, paper thin against the newly escalating fear. He accelerated again, the old sedan strained by the extra pressure. The road wound its way through the hills, every bend a blind plunge into the dark, inky blackness. But the lights were still there, an unrelenting, unspoken presence. Arthur's imagination started going into overdrive, imagining late-night horror movie scenarios. Was it some trucker who was high on something, playing a deadly game of cat and mouse? Or something worse? Something inexplicable? He was trying to remember if he'd seen the lights back in town, before he turned onto this lonely stretch of highway. He couldn't be sure. He had been so lost in his thoughts, lost in the labyrinth of his own anxieties. He braked hard, the tires protesting against the wet asphalt. The car fishtailed before he regained control and pulled over to the side of the road. The engine died with a metallic thump, a rough counterpoint to the frenzied beat of his heart. He held his breath, waiting for the other car to come up alongside him, for a gruff voice to ask, "What's the problem, buddy?" Or, "Heaven help us, something much worse." But nothing happened. He waited, seconds stretching into acute minutes. Only the drumming rain and the frantic beat of his own heart. He finally dared a peek in the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty. Utterly, terrifyingly empty. The headlights were gone. A wave of relief washed over him, so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. He'd outrun them. He'd shaken them off. He'd been imagining things, letting his fear get the better of him. He inhaled deeply, attempting to ease his thundering heart. He needed to go home, sleep. He had to be there for his father. He shifted the car into gear, glanced over his shoulder and backed onto the highway. The interior light came on, bathing the back seat in light. And that's when he saw it. In the back, shrouded in the cold, stark light, sat a figure. A sunken, skeletal creature, its skin pulled tight over its bones. Its eyes, empty holes of endless shadows, stared straight into him. It was impossibly still, its being exuding an aura of ancient, crushing dread. Arthur's blood turned to ice. He could not scream, could not move, could not even breathe. He was rendered immobile by a fear so deep it might shatter his sanity. The figure reached slowly, so achingly, slowly, upward. The skin was paper thin, the bones showing through. The hand pleaded with him to reach out, to reach out. Then, suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Arthur gulped, drawing breath as if he had been drowning. He stomped his foot down on the accelerator, the car rocketing forward onto the highway. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He drove and drove and drove, mindlessly, remorselessly, primal instinct surging just to escape. He had no idea where he was heading, and didn't particularly care. He just had to get away. Hours later, as the sunlight began to paint faint streaks across the horizon, he finally pulled over at a gas station. He had miles to go, in a town he did not know. He could hardly hold on to the steering wheel, his hands trembling so badly. He got out of the car, his legs feeling weak as jelly. He needed coffee. He needed answers. He had to find out if he was going insane. In the brightly lit gas station, the clerk, a slouched young man with a bored look and many piercings, hardly paid him any attention as he mumbled his order. Arthur swayed as he poured himself a cup of hot coffee. He leaned against the counter, trying to collect himself, trying to convince himself that what he had seen in the backseat was a hallucination, a creation of his sleep-addled brain. But he knew it wasn't. He felt it in the deepest, most primal part of his being. While he was pondering his breath, he noticed the security monitor above the cashier. The monitor showed a grainy black and white image of the gas pumps outside. And parked at one of the pumps, cast in the stark, artificial light, sat his car. He froze up, his heart clenching in his chest. He looked at the screen and stared at the image. And then he saw it. In the rear of his vehicle, depicted in the foggy image, was the figure. Waiting, quietly, patiently, sitting still. Arthur lost his balance, knocking over a rack of candy bars. The teller glanced up, startled. "You okay, mister?" he said, his tone tinged with irritation. Arthur couldn't speak. He could only gesture, his finger shaking violently, toward the security monitor. The clerk glanced at where he was looking, then shrugged. "Just your car, man. What's the big deal?" Arthur's mouth opened in an attempt to speak, to explain, to plead. But the words wouldn't come out. And he knew, for absolutely sure, that the clerk would never see that. No one would. The figure was there for him, and only him. He stepped back, slowly, deliberately, until he reached the door. He had to get out of there. He had to keep running. When he got to the door, he looked back at the monitor one last time. The one in the back seat turned its head around. Its cavernous eyes locked on his, across the distance, across the screen filled with static. And then it smiled. Arthur just ran, not knowing where to, just that he had to keep running. It chilled him to know, with utter certainty, with certainty more chilling than death, that the headlights behind him would always be there, waiting, always catching up. Now, he knew it was with him still, this figure, a silent and hollow passenger on a journey that had no destination, a journey into the heart of a nightmare with no end. Back then, his father's grim prognosis had felt like a blessing to him, a release that felt almost a relief compared with the terror that lay in wait for him. No longer was he simply lamenting a dying father. He was grieving his own lost soul. The ghostly caravan. The savage wind howled like a banshee through the mountain pass, raking at the crumbling chassis of Elias Thorne's Volvo. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, the knuckles of his hand bone-white against the aged leather. He was 52, had made long drives before, and had found loneliness an unwelcome companion. But the oppressive darkness tonight felt different, heavier, a neurosis of foreboding. He was many miles from nowhere, the GPS signal feeble and strobing, his phone obstinately declining to connect. He'd heard what happened here, on this stretch of the Black Ridge Pass, a notorious shortcut with unpredictable weather and treacherous terrain. But he was on a tight schedule, and time was money, making a rare antique clock for the next stage of his delivery. And then, in the distance, a welcome sight, headlights. Sets of them, walking at a steady speed. A caravan, a lifeline in this barren stretch. He accelerated, overtaking the end of the procession. There had been about 5 or 6 cars, both SUVs and sedans, their headlights cutting through the inky blackness. He breathed a sigh of relief. Safety in numbers, he thought. As he got into the groove of the caravan, one strange detail stood out to him. All the vehicles were old. The cars were from the late 80s and early 90s, and I was paranoid enough to obsess about them, keeping them immaculate despite the prolapse wear and tear they'd had since graduation. Odd, he thought. You didn't see cars like these on the road much anymore. He attempted to wave at the driver in front of him, a friendly gesture to recognize their common fate, but the driver did not react. Nor did any other driver. They had a stiff, almost robotic gaze fixed on the road ahead, their faces backlit by the glare of the headlights. A weird prickle of unease started creeping up Elias's spine. The road tightened, grazing the edge of a steep drop. The wind picked up again, driving the cars with new force. The lead car, a boxer-looking Bic, rounded a sharp bend, its taillights fading for a moment. Then, nothing. Elias automatically hit the brake. The car behind him had honked, a long blaring note that ricocheted uncomfortably through the pass. Puzzled, he bent over, gazing into the darkness. The Bic was gone. Vanished. What the hell? He muttered under his breath. He pulled his phone back out, though the signal was still by nothing. Annoyed, he glanced back at the car behind him. The driver, a woman with dark hair tied back so tightly it must have hurt, stared straight ahead, eyes glued to an invisible point in the distance. As if the Bic's disappearance hadn't registered at all. Panic started to claw at Elias's throat. He switched on the radio and twisted the dial, but was greeted only by static in the cabin. He was alone. completely and horrifyingly alone. He thought about turning back, but the idea of navigating that dangerous road alone in the dark was far more daunting. He resolved to take it slowly, hoping the Bic had just pulled to the side and that he'd find it farther up the road. As he slowly moved ahead, the remaining cars in the caravan crept along too, sleepy headlights never wavering, their drivers still caught in the feeling that rippled among them. The road grew narrower, the drop-off steeper, more treacherous. He could hear the wind hunting through the gashes in his car door seals, an almost sentient sound, a mourning. Then he saw it. A gap in the trees up ahead, a patch of open sky, and nothing else. The road just stopped, plummeting into a pit of absolute blackness. He stomped the brake again, the Volvo protesting with a screech of tires. He glanced at his rearview mirror. More cars still came, unflagging at their pace, their drivers unaware of the catastrophe approaching. "Stop! Stop!" Elias screamed, his tone trembling with terror. But the wind swallowed his words. He knew they could not hear him, with a kind of deep, chilling certainty. They were one way or another, being when marched to their death. He waved his arms in a fruitless hope that it might work, flashing his headlights and honking his horn. The cars were still moving, glinting in the strange light. They came, and each stepped into the void, one by one, over the precipice, into the darkness. The noise was sickening, a gruesome cacophony of steel against stone, followed by a quiet so absolute it was horrifying. Elias froze, heart pounding against ribs, acrid smoke of burning rubber curling around him. He knew he had seen the impossible, something that didn't make sense. He had witnessed death, instigated by an invisible hand. Slowly, with great care, he turned his car in a tight U-turn, the tires skidding on the loose gravel. He had to get out of there. He needed to escape the grasp of this wretched area. But as he drove back the route he had come, the wind taunted him, carrying secrets he had no desire to hear. It seemed to protest in the dark any further would force the shadows to swallow him around him. Gripping the steering wheel, he pulled his gaze from side to side, expecting, no, hoping, something, anything would be lurking in the shadows. They are coming. The last thing he told himself while he drove endlessly was the image of those cars going over the edge endless in his mind. And then it appeared, the familiar glow of distant lights, the signposts welcoming him back to civilization. He stopped at the first gas station he passed, his hands shaking so badly he could hardly work the pump. The attendant, a young man with droopy eyes, barely looked at him. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice flat. Elias hesitated. He wanted to tell him everything he had seen, to warn him still about the perils of the Black Ridge Pass. But he knew the young man would not believe him. He'd think he was crazy. "Yeah," Elias replied, his voice raspy. "Just a long night. Real long." He paid for his gasoline and drove on, putting Black Ridge Pass far in the rearview. But he knew he would never really escape it. His dreams would always be haunted by the specter of this caravan, the empty drivers, and the spooky plunge into the dark. Years passed. Elias never mentioned what he had seen that night. He dropped off the clock, got paid, and tried to forget. But faced with an old Bic, or a faded sedan, the old familiar chill would creep up his spine. One day, he happened upon an ancient newspaper clipping that had been buried for decades in a dusty antique store. It was about a group of travelers who had disappeared on the Black Ridge Pass in the late 1980s. They were never recovered and the case was eventually closed, ruled a tragic accident. It named the makes and models of the missing vehicles, a Bic, a sedan, and multiple SUVs, all from the same era. Elias's blood ran cold as he stared at the names. But he knew, with a sickening finality, that he had glimpsed their phantoms, eternally caught in an infinite loop, speeding towards their demise. They had been claimed by the Black Ridge Pass, and now a part of him had been claimed too. A witness, a survivor, chained eternally to the phantom caravan, driving the edge of oblivion. And he knew with horrifying certainty that someday, he might join them. The phantom trucker. The sharp wind howled outside, shaking the cab of Mac's 18-wheeler as if a bony hand were trying its grip. Rain drummed on the windshield, turning the ribbon of highway unfurling before him into a distorted mental image. It was a night for ghost stories, The sort of stories that truckers would trade back and forth at truck stops, nursing lukewarm cups of coffee and feeling the weight of the road, so lonely. Mac scoffed. He was a man of reason, of diesel engines and delivery schedules, not phantom trucks and skeletal drivers. He'd been dragging lumber from Oregon to Denver for the last 15 hours, his eyes on fire, his muscles aching. Just outside Cheyenne, he spotted someone huddled beneath a flickering neon sign. Drenched and shivering, one thumb out and pleading. Mac hesitated. He didn't often pick up hitchhikers. Too much risk. But the woman seemed truly distressed, and the storm was getting worse. He sighed. Exhaustion had won. He pulled over. A flurry of freezing breeze and desperation followed her as she rushed into the cab. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "God, thank you." Mac grunted and resumed the highway. "Where you headed?" "Anywhere but here," the woman said, her eyes shifting nervously to the rearview mirror. "Just away." He glanced at her. Maybe mid-30s, with haunted eyes and clothes clinging to her like a second skin. "Trouble?" She swallowed hard. "You could say that." The silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic thump of the tires against the tarmac and the relentless drumming of the rain. Eventually, Mac, by nature of a trucker's curiosity, said, "So, what are you running from?" The woman flinched. "You wouldn't believe me. Try me." She paused, and finally blurted out, "A truck. A phantom truck." Mac chuckled, a low rumbling in his chest. "Phantom truck? You mean like a ghost truck? Get out of here." "I'm serious," she exclaimed in an increasingly high-pitched voice. "It has been following me for days. Everywhere I go, it appears. It's powered by a skeleton." Mac snorted. "All right, now you're just kidding me. A skeleton driver? What, does he steer with his ribcage?" He looked at her, expecting a smirk, a sign that she was just pulling his leg. But her face was white, her eyes wide with real fear. "I'm not lying," she said in a whisper. "I saw it. I saw him. It's an old truck, a Peterbilt, maybe. Black, with rust in the metal. And the driver, just bone and empty sockets." Mac forced a laugh. All right. Put down the horror movies, lady. You're spooking me." But even as he spoke the words, he felt a tingle of discomfort run up his spine. The storm appeared to be getting stronger, the wind shrieking like a banshee. He glanced in his mirrors, a reflex developed over years of operating in the right lane. And then he saw it. In his side mirror, two blinding beams of light cutting through the rain. A dark shape materialized behind them, growing larger by terrifying amounts. It was a truck, all right. An ancient, rotting Peterbilt, black paint flaking, rust nibbling at its bone like some famished beast. He glanced at the woman. She was stiff, staring into the mirror, her face devoid of any color. "That's it," she gasped, her voice a whisper. "That's the truck." Mac sat clenching the steering wheel, knuckles pale. It was only a coincidence, he told himself, a beat-up pickup truck driven by some reckless idiot. But the pace with which it engulfed him never made sense. He floored the accelerator. The engine rumbled, whining under the weight, but the Peterbilt inched closer and closer. It was like running scared from a nightmare. "It wants you," the woman whispered in a quaking voice. "It wishes to add you to its collection." Mac was silent, watching the road. He attempted to radio for help but heard only static. The storm appeared to be scrambling the signal. The Peterbilt rolled up beside him, the engine rumbling like some guttural monster deep in Mac's chest. He glanced over. And then he saw it. The driver, illuminated only by the muffled glow of the dashboard lights, was peering through the rain-streaked windshield. Or rather, what was left of him. A skeletal figure, its bones bleached white by time and torture, held the steering wheel. Hollow pits stared straight at Mac, filled with an ancient, malevolent hunger. A dried hand without flesh hung over the gearshift. Mac heaved, his breath hitching his throat. His mind screamed at him to look away, to deny what he was seeing, but he was still, trapped in the skeletal driver's gaze. The Peterbilt veered, striking Mac's truck and sending it careening toward the shoulder. Mac struggled with the steering wheel, battling for control. "We have to get off of the road," the woman screamed. It's the only way. He knew she was right. The ghost truck was driving him out of his mind. He had to escape its clutches. Ahead, he saw a narrow dirt road branching off to the right, only just visible through the rapidly falling storm. He slammed the wheel, and his truck skipped onto the dirt road. The Peterbilt trailed behind a bony-faced skeleton behind its wheel, unperturbed by the shaking death trap. The pursuit was in full motion, the two trucks bouncing and swaying as they rattled along the muddy track deep into the desolate countryside. After some hours, Max saw a rundown barn in the distance. It was his only chance. He slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in front of the barn doors. "Get inside," he yelled, pushing the woman toward the barn. They tumbled inside, the heavy wooden doors groaning closed behind them. Max struggled to fix the old latch, trying her best to latch it. The Peterbilt roared to a stop outside, its headlights exposing the cracks in the barn walls. The engine burbled, a menacing growl in the dark. Mac and the woman huddled close, hearing the rain hammering the barn roof, the low, guttural harangue of the ghost truck. Then, silence. A silence so deep, so total, that it was more terrifying than the storm itself. Mac held his breath, heart pounding in his chest. He didn't dare to move or breathe. And after what felt like an age, he heard it. The screech of metal against metal, the creaking of ancient wood, the unambiguous sound of a truck, a phantom one that does not exist, slowly, inexorably, backing away. Then, the engine roar receding into the distance. Mac and the woman stayed huddled in the darkness for hours until the first light of the dawn poured through the cracks in the doors of the barn. Gradually, cautiously, they pulled out. The storm had passed. The air was clean and fresh. The phantom truck was gone. They never discussed what they had observed that night. They parted ways, their minds no doubt echoing with the image of the skeletal driver and his phantom truck, a chilling warning from the horrors that prowl the lonely roads of the night. Mac kept driving, but he never viewed a Peterbilt the same after that. And sometimes, when the rain was pouring and the wind screaming, he just had to dip into his mirrors, to check. Just to be certain. Because some nightmares never really go away, he knew. They simply bide their time, hiding in the repeater shadows for the right moment to pounce on the next victim. The red lights. Highway 17's endless black ribbon unfurled in front of Mark, devoured by the inky maw of the late October night. Rain pelted against his aging Volvo's windshield, the wipers fighting to keep up. His knuckles were white, his eyes tired, arms heavy as he gripped the steering wheel. The meeting in San Francisco had dragged, and he was now pursuing the promise of his bed in Redwood Creek, about 3 hours north. He hadn't passed another car in nearly an hour. It was unnervingly quiet, disrupted only by the swish of wipers and a quiet rumble of the engine. He turned on the radio, looking for some human voices, but only static crackled in response. He let out a sigh, clicked it off, and reconciled himself to the isolation. Then he spotted it, a solitary, baleful pinprick of red in the distance. A traffic light. Mark frowned. There shouldn't be traffic lights out here, not on this stretch of highway. He eased on the brakes, tires hissing against wet asphalt. As he neared, he noticed the light was indeed stubbornly, impossibly red. He came to a stop, the engine idling clean. He glanced around. Still no other cars. Just the rain, the dark, and the disconcerting red glow. A prickle of unease crawled up his spine. This wasn't right. He waited. 30 seconds passed, then a full minute. The light remained red. Shortly after, impatience fought with a mounting sense of dread. He was about to put the car in park and jump out to look at the light when he saw it. A figure. It was emerging from the woods to the right, a dark figure forming in the shadows. It was moving slowly but deliberately as if dragged by the hand of fate. He couldn't see any details, just a vague, human-shaped mass. A cold, sharp fear cut through his fatigue. He almost instinctively reached for the gearshift to put the car in reverse, to get out. But his hand froze. The engine wouldn't respond. He twisted the key, but his Volvo was stubbornly silent. The figure marched on inexorably closer. It was closer now, and Mark could make out a ragged outline, a shambling gait. The rain must have gotten heavier, blurring the image, though he didn't need to make out the details. He could feel the wrongness radiating from it. It was close enough now that he could barely make out the shape of a gaunt, skeletal face. Mark was frozen in terror and could do nothing but watch. He envisioned the cold, clammy touch of bony fingers on the glass. And then, with a suddenness that made him start, the light turned green. He didn't hesitate. He slammed the gearshift down into drive, his foot pounding on the accelerator. The engine leaped to life, and the Volvo soared ahead, fontaining gravel and water. He didn't look back. He drove for what seemed like forever, heart racing, the air coming in and out of his lungs like a bellows. Then after a few miles, he finally pulled to the roadside, his reed-slim fingers shaking nervously. He killed the engine, buried his face in his hands, and tried to quiet his racing thoughts. He tried to convince himself it was exhaustion, the stress of the day. He had pictured it, summoned an apparition from the dark and the rain. But the fear, cold and persistent, clung to him like a shroud. He exhaled a deep breath, turned the engine back on, and drove back onto the highway. He had to get home. Another hour passed. The rain had reduced to a drizzle, but the darkness was absolute. Just as he feared he had outrun it, another red light, glowing from afar. His stomach clenched. He thought about turning back, giving up on his journey, and getting a motel. The idea of being trapped on this barren highway, alone in the night, made it worse. He kept going, foot to the floor as if speed could somehow save him. He pulled up at the light, the Volvo vibrating a little. This time the figure stepped out of the trees on the left side of the road. This one was different from the first, taller and leaner, its movements fluid, nearly predatory. He thought he saw something gleam in its hand, a long, thin blade. The engine wouldn't start again. He was trapped again, powerless. The figure moved closer, its head tilted to one side, as though studying him. It walked with an otherworldly grace, like a dancer in a gory ballet. As it approached, Mark could see its face, or, more accurately, the absence of one. Where a face should have resided were only smooth, pale skin, featureless. He felt its malice, an angry tide of hatred crashing over him. He shut his eyes, steeling himself for what had to be the ineluctable. Then, the green light. He didn't wait. He stepped on the gas, the Volvo fishtailing unsteadily until it got traction. He dared a look at the rearview mirror and saw the figure, also still, in the road, watching him depart, its featureless face a mask of cold fury. This time, he didn't stop. He drove like a madman, his eyes focused on the road, his senses heightened. He knew, with an icy certainty, that the lights weren't random. They were a snare, a hunt being played by something primordial, something malignant. The only way to win was to stay alive. His muscles were protesting as he drove for what felt like an eternity. He watched the mirror scouting, looking into the trees. He pointed and began to mentally prepare himself for that third red light, which he noticed miles ahead. Finally, he saw it ahead. The third point of crimson. He inhaled deeply to soothe his racing mind and pounding heart. He braked, the Volvo shuddering to a stop. This time, the red light flickered with menacing energy, as if taunting you from the shadows. He paused and placed his hand over the gearshift. He knew what was coming. Two figures emerged from the inky blackness. They were the first two, but not the last. They were surrounding the car, advancing slowly, methodically. On this occasion, the shadowy creature on the right held a large maul in one hand. Their face, now visible in the dim light of the dashboard lights, twisted in the distorted shapes of pure, raw hate. Mark squeezed his eyes shut as tears ran down his cheeks. He was out of time. He was out of hope. He was trapped. The engine wouldn't start. Then he felt a funny calm wash over him. He accepted his fate. He thought of his wife, his children, and his life. He wanted to see them one last time. The defiance came from nowhere and swallowed him whole. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. He was not going to die cowering in fear. He opened his eyes, focused on the looming figures, and screamed. Just as the figures arrived at the car, their hands outstretched, the light turned. Mark didn't wait. The engine erupted in a roar and the Volvo lunged forward, barely avoiding the figures as it sped into the dark. He didn't look back. He kept on driving until dawn, until the first rays of sun lanced through the horizon. He kept going until he got to the house, his safe space. He stepped through the door, fell into his wife's arms, and cried. He never again drove Highway 17. He never mentioned the red lights, the figures in the darkness. But each time that a red light came up, he felt the shiver of ice run down his spine. He knew in his heart that they were still out there, lying in wait in the dark, patiently biding their time. And he knew, with a dread that would never leave him, that one day, it would find him again. The endless tunnel. The dash clock showed 2:17 a.m., flashing. Rain pounded the windshield of the old Volvo, blurring the already half-indistinct lines of the highway. Martin paled, his eyes raw from fatigue. He had been driving for 10 hours straight, powered by lukewarm coffee and the desperate need to get to his brother in Boston. He spotted the sign just in time to miss when he would have missed it, Blackwood Ton next right. He hesitated. The tunnel wasn't on his intended route, but the Highway Patrol website had warned of extensive flooding further north. Maybe this was the detour he needed to take. He indicated the steady little click of solace in the deluge and swung onto the exit ramp. Approaching the tunnel entrance, a gaping maw of dark concrete devoured the road hole. Above the opening, a single flickering fluorescent light cast long, distorted shadows, like the open mouth of a monster. Martin may have been immune to the image, but for a prick of unease. He shook it off. He was tired, that was all. He turned on his headlights, the beams piercing the heavy blackness. The roar of the rain receded behind him as he drove deeper in, supplanted only by the low, steady buzz of the tunnel's turbines. The walls, rough, wet concrete, streaked with grime and water stains, began to close in around him. After about 5 minutes, Martin began to feel that something was amiss. By now he should have made it to the other side. Especially not tunnels that long. He glanced in his rearview mirror, but there was nothing but the trailing ring of his taillights disappearing into the night. He pushed down on the accelerator, the Volvo protesting. 10 minutes. Still inside. But the air was thick and heavy, and the hum of the ventilation was becoming deafening in its own right. A cold snake of claustrophobic dread twisted around his ribs, slithering into his mind. He switched on the radio, seeking music, a news report of any belated excitement, anything to shatter the smothering quiet. Static. Just a hiss of white noise. He frantically turned the dial, looking for a signal. Then, a voice. It was warped, guttural, just a whisper above the static, but human. 3 hours, the voice rasped, then faded again into the noise. Martin's blood ran cold. 3 hours. What did that mean? He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, knuckles white. He tapped the radio centerpiece again, spinning through the stations. 2 hours, 57 minutes. The voice crackled back, distorted but clearer now, the static a little less obtrusive. It was counting down. Panic started to scratch at his throat. He stomped down on the brakes, the tires squealing on the slick asphalt. The Volvo ground to a halt. He gazed into the distance, his heart pounding in his chest. A black hole ahead of him in the tunnel. There was no light, no indication of an exit. He tried to rationalize. Just some prank, some local weirdo with a CB radio messing around on a lonely stretch of road. But that voice, the blood-chilling malevolence in its tone. He needed to get out. He put the car in reverse and hit the gas. The Volvo shuddered and leapt backward, the engine screaming in protest. He looked in the rearview mirror, waiting for the mouth of the tunnel to form behind him. Nothing. Nothing but darkness, endless and receding, and the dim, mocking glow of his taillights. 2 hours, 52 minutes, the voice crackled on the radio, closer now, as if it were inside the car with him. He stomped on the brakes again, panting for breath. He turned the radio off, trying to shut the voice up, but the absence of sound was even worse. It was a heavy kind of silence, a suffocating one, saturated with unspoken dread. He looked at the walls. It was like they had gotten closer, the concrete rougher, more threatening. Were they moving? He blinked, attempting to clear his sight. No, it was only imagination. He was exhausted and frazzled, and the darkness was getting into his head. He checked the gas gauge. Half a tank. He had enough to keep going. He had to keep going. He put the car in drive and hit the gas. The Volvo edged forward, its headlights casting a small circle of light on the tunnel. His eyes were straining in the dark, and he only stared forward, looking for anything that resembled an exit. 2 hours, 46 minutes, the voice came back, more powerful, somehow amplified, as though it were coming from the tunnel itself. He avoided it and concentrated on the road ahead. He had to remain calm, had to stay focused. Panic wouldn't help. But the walls, they had been a lot closer now. He could feel the concrete weighing him down, an asphyxiating pressure. The tunnel shrank and the enclosure around him shrank with it, second by second. He punched the gas, the Volvo straining against the invisible hamster cage pressing in on him. The air was thickening, growing stale, and his lungs seared with each inhale. 2 hours, 38 minutes. He had a look at the dashboard. The fuel gauge was plummeting. Impossible. He hadn't driven that far. But the needle was sinking lower and lower, closer to empty. He turned to the road, open-eyed with fear. The walls were nearly within reach now, so close he could almost touch them. Remembrance Tunnel. It was just wide enough for his car. 2 hours, 30 minutes. With a violent shudder, the car slammed sideways, the side mirror skimming the concrete wall. He flinched, his heart racing in his chest. He was trapped. He was going to die here in this endless tunnel. He opened his mouth to scream, but his throat was too dry, his voice too weak. What emerged instead was a toothless whimper. He glanced at the dashboard again. The fuel gauge was empty. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The headlights blinked and died, leaving him in complete darkness. 2 hours, 20 minutes. He was alone. Completely alone. In the stifling blackness, surrounded by the frigid, unyielding concrete, with only the disembodied voice counting down the minutes left in his life. He reached for his phone, seeking a signal, any signal. Nothing. Just the words "no service" taunting him from the screen. He shut his eyes, his cheeks wet with tears. He thought of his brother, of his family, of everything he would never see again. He prepared himself for the end. 1 hour, 50 minutes. Now the walls closed in on him, so close he could feel dampness seeping into his clothes. He could hear the faint sleet of concrete against metal, the sound of the tunnel slamming shut. He could barely breathe. It was hot, stagnant air, and his lungs were shrieking for oxygen. 1 hour, 30 minutes. He had a pressure building in his chest, crushing down on him so it was difficult to move. He was trapped, pressed against the seat, and unable even to lift his head. 1 hour. His eyesight started to fade amid strident darkness that crested around him, engulfing him. He struggled to breathe, but there was no air. He was suffocating. 30 minutes. A sudden burst of pain followed in his head as a burning sensation tore through his mind. His body was twitching, his muscles throbbing wildly. 10 minutes. He lost consciousness. The voice kept counting down, its warped tones bouncing off the walls of the empty tube until there was no air to count anymore. 0. Silence. Then, a faint scraping sound. The walls of the tunnel had kept bringing the two together, slowly, relentlessly, until the Volvo was crumpled into a twisted lump of metal, and the infinite tunnel was filled with darkness alone. Outside, the rain fell still more endlessly, as though to cleanse the memory of the man who had dared breach the Blackwood Tunnel from existence. And not far, at the static of a lonely radio frequency, a flared voice cackled, just waiting to greet its next stop of snacks. The radio broadcast. 4 miles around, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound. Outside, the inky black of the rural highway closed in on Jack's aging Ford Explorer, a stretch of wide road broken only by the rare ghostly light from headlights passing in the opposite direction. He had been driving for hours, a good solid 8 at the very least, trying to get back to his family after a long, draining business trip. The growl of the engine and the sameness of the road were beginning to bore him. He twisted and turned the radio, trying to find a signal, anything, broken up voices, just something to break the weight of silence. Static hissed and crackled. Out in the wilderness, a clear signal was intractable. Finally, a station came to life after one persistent turn of the dial. "And we're coming to you live from Well, that's a good question, isn't it? Just past Harmony Creek, northbound on Route 12. Jack frowned. He was out at exactly where Route 12 was. Harmony Creek was a good 50 miles behind. Coincidence, he thought, and a vague description. He brushed it off and sank back, grateful that he had found something, anything, to listen to. The voice was calm, almost soothing, a male announcer who had a slight, nearly unnoticeable drawl. Now let's check in to see what our listeners are doing tonight. Ah, yes, a gentleman in a dark blue late model Ford Explorer, now passing, mile marker 78. You're a little bit of a weary traveler, I would say. Been on the road a long time. Jack's blood ran cold. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. Mile marker 78. That's exactly where he was. Impossible. It had to be a joke, some sort of elaborate gag. He looked around him for vans, antennas, and any sign of a coordinated effort. But there was not, only the blackness that goes for infinity. He tried to write it off. Maybe it was a CB radio prank, and he'd simply tuned in to the right frequency. But the clarity of the signal, the dry professionalism of the announcer, it felt different. Ominous. He attempted to change the station, the dial spinning madly, but every frequency to which he switched had the same soothing voice. Not time to change the channel, my friend. We're here for you. Just past mile marker 77, right? I bet you think of your wife and kids back home. Long trip. Missing them. The voice was a cold hand against his spine. There was a light sheen of sweat on his forehead. This couldn't be happening. He drove faster, driving the Explorer harder, hoping to get away from the broadcast, hoping to escape its suffocating embrace. Don't push yourself so hard. Just past mile marker 76. Now getting a bit frantic, are we? Mirror check, scan for, what, exactly? A van? An antenna? You won't find anything. We're everywhere, and nowhere. Each word landed like a hammer blow, each detail a noose drawn tight. His heart raced in his chest while he looked in his mirrors once more. Still nothing. There was only the endless road behind him. He felt completely naked, stripped bare beneath the clinical eye of the voice. He attempted to tell himself it was a hallucination, fatigue distorting his mind. But the voice was too direct, too actual. And the accuracy was irrefutable. Mile marker 75. Slowing down a bit now. Smart move. We wouldn't want to get any unwanted attention now, would we? So, Alabitu Kalin up somebody? Go ahead. But who would you call? And what would you say? Help. A radio station is narrating all my movements. They raced, think you'd lost it. He reflexively reached for his phone and stopped. The voice was right. Who would believe him? He wouldn't have believed it himself if he wasn't living it. He was all alone, trapped in a nightmare of sound. He drove on, each mile marker a dismal countdown. The voice continued its narration, telling of his hopes, his fears, his history. It talked about his father's premature death, his battles with anxiety, the private reservations he had about his career. It was an invasion, a violation of the deepest caverns of his mind. Mile marker 70. During your college days, do you remember a particular time? The party? The girl? You thought no one knew. But we know everything. We see everything. He inhaled sharply, a strangled sound swallowed up in the roar of the engine. The girl, that was a momentary lapse, a weakness he had buried deep. How could they know? It was low, raspy, and bone-knottingly chuckled. We know all your secrets, all your regrets. And we know what's in store for you. He caught his breath in his throat. What was waiting for him? He didn't want to know. He just wanted to go home, to see his wife and kids, to be safe again. Mile marker 65. Almost there. Almost home. But are you certain you truly want to G home? Are you certain that what you'll find waiting there is what you believe? The implication was heavy, oppressive. Was his family in danger? Was this one big elaborate scheme to, what? Torture him? Drive him insane? Fear was a tangible weight in his chest, but he pressed on. Mile marker 60. The bridge is coming up. That old wooden bridge. You know the stories they tell about that bridge? The accidents, the disappearances. He knew the bridge. It was an old, creaky structure over a deep ravine. It was said to be cursed, haunted by the ghosts of those who died there, local lore claimed. He had always thought it was folklore, campfire lore. But now, he saw the sign. Harmony Creek, 10 miles. He was getting closer. But the closer he came, the more certain he became something terrible was about to happen. Mile marker 58. The bridge is in sight. Slow down, now. We wouldn't want an accident, now would we? Not even on the bridge. He hit the brakes, squealing his tires in protest. The bridge loomed ahead in darkness, an ominous silhouette against the starless sky. It appeared more malevolent than he recalled. Mile marker 57. Almost there. Just a little further. A little closer to home. He moved forward, hands shaking on the steering wheel. He was directly in front of the bridge. He paused, foot poised above the accelerator. He couldn't do it. He couldn't get on that bridge to drive. Mile marker 56. Come on, now. Don't be afraid. Just a little trust. Just a little faith. He inhaled deeply and stepped on the gas. The Explorer jolted forward, tires rumbling across the rotting wooden planks. The vehicle thundered over the bridge, shaking it with every turn. The voice became louder, more animated. Mile marker 55. You're almost there. Almost home. Almost safe. He hit the midpoint of the bridge. Out of nowhere, the Explorer suddenly lurched violently to the left. He struggled to recover control, his heart pounding in his ears. The radio crackled. And now, the conclusion. The voice changed, was no longer soothing, was no longer calm. It was matter of fact, deeply unfeeling and brutal. You'll never make it home. The bridge gave way. He screamed as the Explorer fell into the dark below. The radio, still buzzing, filled the empty silence of the night around him, a haunting chorus to his last moments. The last thing he heard before the darkness engulfed him was static interspersed with the distant, barely discernible drawl, and that, folks, is what we call a rap. The midnight delivery. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the windshield wipers was the only sound vying with the mournful howl of the wind. The rain beat against the glass, smearing what little distinction remained in the landscape into a watercolor of grays and blacks. Mark cursed quietly and squinted at the GPS. The address shimmered eerily on the screen, 13 Hemlock Lane. Remote didn't begin to define this place, it was nearly on the edge of the world. He normally steered clear of late-night deliveries, but the extra cash was too enticing. His wife, Sarah, had recently lost her job, and the growing bills were beginning to feel like a physical weight on his chest. This one, a rush delivery, confidential contents, included a premium he couldn't resist. At long last he found a crumbling sign, clinging to a rotted post, that said Hemlock Lane. The road tapered, forming a rutted birth canal that seemed to devour his aging minivan with a sense of foreboding. Arriving branches raked the roof, their skeletal fingers scraping an unsettling tune. Mark shivered and buttoned his jacket up tighter. It was more than just the cold. A feeling that wasn't on the weather map had taken root in his stomach, a primitive instinct telling him to retreat. At last, the house materialized out of the dark, a gothic monstrosity, defiant, etched against the storm-ravaged sky. It was like something out of a Hammer horror film, all gables, turrets, and dark, unblinking windows. No lights shone from within. One presence kept its place and sat beside me on the bench, simply enduring the oppressive silence pressed down upon us, through the pummeling rain and the wind's mournful wail. He looked at the delivery instructions once again, printed on a crisp, unnaturally white card: leave package at the door. Do not look inside. Do not contact the recipient. Oh, come on, yeah right, Mark sighed, taking the package from the rear. It was heavy. I was surprised that a wooden box, bound with heavy, black twine. He walked with leaden feet to the porch, the ancient floorboards creaking beneath him. The sense of wet earth and something else metallic, faintly acrid, thickened the air. He set the box down on the porch, half expecting the door to creak open and a ghoulish figure to sweep it in. But nothing happened. It is as if the silence was never broken. He should just go, get back into the van, and put this whole nightmare behind him. But something held him back. The weight of the box, the absurd directions, the uncanny wrongness of atmosphere, it bored into his curiosity. He looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. The rain had subsided somewhat, and the moon came through the clouds, penning elongated, wavy shadows. No one was watching. He couldn't resist. He unwound the twine, carefully. His fingers sensed the cold, clammy wood of the box. He raised the lid and found it in his throat. Inside, resting on a bed of tarnished velvet, were teeth. Human teeth. Hundreds, neatly lined up, their surfaces glimmering unnervingly in the moonlight. Molars, incisors, canines, each one a bitter reminder of mortality, of rot, of something deeply, viscerally wrong. A wave of nausea hit him. Quivering hands slammed shut the lid. He needed to get out of here. Now. He staggered back to the van and fumbled the keys. When he finally managed to get the door open, he heard it. A sound that chilled the blood in his veins. A slow, deliberate creak from the house. He whirled, his eyes working to cut through the gloom. The front door was opening. Slowly. Silently. A silhouette came into view, hidden in the gloom of the porch. It was lanky, its face hidden from view by the dark. But Mark could feel its eyes, cold and watchful, on him. It emitted a deep, guttural growl from its throat. He didn't wait to see more. He jumped in the van, slammed the door, and shoved the key in the ignition. Will the engine sputter, cough, and finally roar to life? He slammed the van into reverse and squealed out of the driveway, gravel flying behind him. He checked the rearview mirror. The figure stood on the porch, motionless, watching him leave. Mark could sense it, even through the dark, the evil of it, the blurry vow of it chasing him. He floored the accelerator, the van fishtailing across the wet road. He didn't know how far behind the figure was, but he knew at least that it was nearing. He could feel it in his bones. He took a risk and looked in the rearview mirror again. The figure was gone. Relief washed over him, then a new wave of terror. Where had it gone? Then he saw them. Two bright spots of red in the dark behind him. Eyes. They were getting closer. He slammed the accelerator. The van struggled over rocks. The eyes were gaining. He could hear it now, a rhythmic thumping that was getting louder and louder. Footsteps. Fast. Relentless. He dodged a fallen branch, the van skidding dangerously close to the shoulder. His heart pounding in his chest, he managed to regain control just in the nick of time. The eyes were so close behind him now. The shape was hard to make out in the darkness, but he could tell that its limbs were long, spindly, and moved unnaturally fast. He hit the main road, the tires screaming as he turned. He distanced himself as far as he could from Hemlock Lane. It was not until he dragged himself to the safety of the well-lit gas station on the outskirts of town that he stopped. He sloshed in, drenched to the bone, face ashen. The cashier, a bored teenager with a nose ring, stared at him with partial interest. "You okay, mister?" she asked. He couldn't speak. He shook his head, as if trying to catch his breath. He needed to call the police. He had to tell them what he had seen. But what would he say? That he'd dropped off a box of teeth at some creepy house in the middle of nowhere, and was now being chased by a monster? They'd think he was crazy. He decided to go home. He wanted Sarah, to touch her, to sense the quotidian normalcy of their life. He got home to a hushed house, a dark driveway. The darkness was unnerving. He'd never realized how dependent he'd been on the porch light before. Inside, Sarah was sleeping on the couch, the TV flickering with a late-night talk show. He gently shook her awake. "Mark, what time is it?" she groaned, rubbing her eyes. He simply held her close, burying his face in her hair. "I love you, Sarah," he said softly. "I love you too," she said, her voice still heavy with sleep. "What's wrong? You're shaking." He did, but not to tell her all. No, he couldn't. He didn't want to subject her to his nightmare. "Just a long night," he said. "Go back to sleep." He sat up, unable to rest. He peered through the window, half expecting to see the glowing red eyes in the dark, but the street was quiet, the houses dark. And he told himself that he was being paranoid. that it was just a bad dream, that the figure was gone. He was wrong. He listened to a gentle scratching noise from the front porch. His blood froze in his veins. Afterward came the creak of the front door. He didn't have to look to see what was there. He knew that someone in the dark was waiting for it. He could feel it in his gut. The delivery was complete.